Think he's even allowed to be on this side of the range? The words, sharp and edged with the kind of casual arrogance only a 22-year-old in peak physical condition can muster, cut through the shimmering heat waves rising from the packed dirt. Cade adjusted the brim of his cap, his eyes, hidden behind dark ballistic glasses, fixed on the old man setting up his gear 2 lanes down. The man was a study in beige and gray, faded khaki trousers, a loose gray shirt that did nothing to hide the stoop in his shoulders, and a baseball cap so worn the logo was an unreadable smudge. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy that the younger men mistook for the stiffness of age. They saw a relic, a civilian who'd somehow wandered onto a private range day reserved for Naval Special Warfare Development Group candidates. They saw a liability. Bowen, Cade's swim buddy and rival in all things, let out a low chuckle. Probably got lost looking for the bingo hall. Somebody should tell him the targets here shoot back, metaphorically speaking. He racked the bolt on his brand new Mark 22 sniper rifle. The sound, a crisp metallic clack that was pure authority. The rifle was a marvel of modern engineering, a modular system capable of chambering 3 different calibers, optics that could practically see into next week, and a chassis that looked like it was designed by a fighter jet engineer. Everything about their gear screamed cutting-edge, lethal precision. The old man, meanwhile, was unlatching a wooden case, not a high-impact polymer Pelican case with custom-cut foam, but a dark, oil-stained wooden box lined with what looked like faded green felt. It was the kind of case you'd see in a museum exhibit on the Great War. Cade and Bowen exchanged another look, this one a mixture of pity and derision. Inside the case lay a rifle that looked just as ancient. It was long, with a heavy wooden stock that was scarred and dented from decades of use. The barrel was thick and dark, the bluing worn to a soft silver gray in places. An old-fashioned leather sling was coiled neatly beside it. "Is that a Remington 700? Javi, the quietest of their fire team, asked from behind them. He had a technician's eye and a historian's curiosity. The old kind, from like Vietnam? Probably his dad's, Cade scoffed, chambering a .338 Norma Magnum round. Look, he's even got a little notebook. Bet he writes down his grocery list in it. The old man, seemingly oblivious to the commentary, was indeed consulting a small, spiral-bound notebook. His fingers, gnarled but steady, traced a line of handwritten data. He then produced a simple Kestrel wind meter, held it up for a moment, and jotted something else down. His movements were unhurried, a stark contrast to the coiled, explosive energy of the young SEALs, who moved with the sharp efficiency drilled into them at Bud/S. They were weapons, honed and ready. He looked like a grandfather getting ready for a quiet afternoon of plinking. The only thing that didn't quite fit was the stillness in his posture when he finally settled behind his rifle. He didn't just lie down, he seemed to merge with the ground, his body forming a single, stable platform with the earth. There was a practiced fluidity to it that was dissonant with his apparent age. It was a flicker of something else, a ghost of a forgotten discipline, but the young men were too busy admiring their own reflections in their high-tech scopes to notice. The range itself was a beast. Carved out of the high desert of California, it was a sniper's paradise and a novice's nightmare. The wind was a living thing, a trickster that gusted and swirled through the canyons, its direction changing from 100-meter increment to the next. Mirage, the shimmering distortion caused by the intense heat, made distant targets dance and swim, turning a clear sight picture into a watery illusion. It was a place that separated the technicians from the artists, the shooters who could calculate data from the marksmen who could feel the shot in their bones. Today was a day for the artists. The heat was brutal, the mirage a shimmering curtain, and the wind was a fickle devil whispering lies in their ears. The instructor for the day, a grizzled senior chief named Gunny Malone, walked the line. He was a man who had forgotten more about long-range shooting than most would ever learn. He stopped behind Cade and Bowen. "All right, ladies, you've proven you can hit the 1,000-meter plate all day. Let's see what you're really made of. Look out there." He pointed towards the far end of the range, a place that seemed to dissolve into the horizon. 2,000 meters. We call her the Ghost. Most days you can't even see her through the shimmer. You got a spotter, you got the best glass in the world. Let's see if you can make the steel sing. A low whistle went through the group. 2,000 meters was more than a mile. It was a mathematical problem wrapped in an atmospheric puzzle. A slight miscalculation in windage, a 1 mile/hour shift, and the bullet would drift over 15 feet off target. A tiny error in elevation, and it would drop into the dirt 100 feet short. It was a shot that bordered on theoretical for most shooters. For these young operators, it was the ultimate test, a chance to prove they belonged to the 1% of the 1%. Cade grinned, the challenge lighting a fire in his eyes. "No problem, Gunny. Bowen owes me $100, says I hit it before he does." "You're on," Bowen shot back, already dialing his elevation turret. "Prepare to be poor, pretty boy." The old man, 2 lanes down, continued his quiet preparations. He screwed a long black suppressor onto the end of his barrel, the threads turning with a smooth, well-oiled whisper. He didn't seem to be paying any attention to the challenge laid down by the instructor. He was in his own world, a bubble of concentration that the noise and bluster of the young men couldn't penetrate. He laid out 5 rounds on his shooting mat. They were hand-loaded, the brass polished to a dull gleam, the bullets seated with meticulous uniformity. He picked one up, his thumb rubbing over the smooth copper jacket for a moment, before he gently slid it into the rifle's chamber and closed the bolt with a quiet, decisive click. It was a sound a world away from the aggressive rack of the modern rifles, a sound of intimacy and familiarity. It was the sound of a tool that was not just used, but known. Gunny Malone's eyes flickered over to the old man's lane. He hadn't really paid him much mind before. The range was occasionally open to vetted civilian long-range enthusiasts and retired personnel. Usually they kept to themselves, content to shoot at more reasonable distances. This old-timer, though, there was something about his setup. The rifle was old, a vintage Remington 700 and a Macmillan A2 stock maybe, but the scope mounted on it was a Schmidt & Bender PM2, a piece of glass that cost more than a used car. And the way he was settled into the earth, it wasn't the posture of a hobbyist. It was the posture of a man who had spent a significant portion of his life looking through a scope, waiting for something. Gunny made a mental note to check the man's credentials later, but for now, his focus was on his students. "All right, Cade, you're up. Talk me through it," Gunny ordered, his voice all business. Cade settled in, his spotter, Javi, setting up his own high-powered scope beside him. "Wind is shifting, coming from 2 o'clock, maybe 6 to 8 miles per hour. I'm seeing mirage running right to left. I'm holding 2 mils left for wind, dialing 36 mils of elevation, sending it." The pronouncement was confident, the culmination of thousands of hours of training. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, a controlled explosion that sent a shockwave of dust and sound across the range. The vapor trail of the bullet was briefly visible, a faint shimmer corkscrewing through the air before the mirage swallowed it. They all waited, counting the seconds for the flight time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Silence. Then, Javi, peering intently through his spotting scope, sighed. "Impact short and right, way right. Wind must have picked up over that last ridge." Cade cursed under his breath, cycled the bolt, and began the process again, his initial confidence replaced by a nod of frustration. Bowen was next. His calculations were slightly different, his holdover more aggressive. The result was the same. A puff of dust far from the target. For the next hour, it was a masterclass in failure. The young SEALs, paragons of physical and mental strength, threw everything they had at the problem. They used their advanced ballistic calculators, their sophisticated wind meters, their years of training. The little white speck of a steel target at 2,000 meters remained untouched, a silent, taunting monument to their limits. The initial bravado evaporated under the relentless sun, replaced by a sullen, professional focus that still yielded no results. Finally, Gunny Malone called a ceasefire. "All right, that's enough. You're just burning barrels at this point. The conditions are shit. It's a low percentage shot on a good day. Today, it's a no-go. Pack it up, we'll hit the classroom." Disappointment hung heavy in the air. For men who defined themselves by their ability to do the impossible, failure was a bitter pill. As they began to clear their rifles, a quiet voice drifted down the line. "Excuse me, Senior Chief." Gunny Malone turned. It was the old man. He had risen to one knee, his expression polite and unassuming. Would you mind if I took a shot at it while it's still set up? Cade and Bowen, who were packing their gear, stopped dead. They looked at each other, and a slow, incredulous smile spread across Cade's face. He couldn't help it. The sheer absurdity of the request was too much. After they, with the best equipment and training on the planet, had failed for an hour straight, this fossil with his museum piece wanted to take a crack at it. It was like a man with a rowboat asking to enter the America's Cup. Bowen was less charitable. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "that's a 2,000-meter target. That's a long way." He gestured vaguely at the old rifle. "I'm not sure your equipment is rated for that kind of distance." The old man's eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, met Bowen's for a moment. There was no anger in them, no defensiveness, just a calm, steady gaze. "The equipment is fine," he said, his voice soft but clear. "It's never let me down." Gunny Malone looked from the confident young SEAL to the quiet old man. His gut, an instrument honed by 30 years of service, told him something was off. He'd seen that quiet confidence before, and it was rarely misplaced. He was about to dismiss the idea, to save the old man the embarrassment, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the Schmidt and Bender scope. Maybe it was the way the old man's hands rested on his rifle, not like an owner, but like a partner. "Let him shoot," Gunny said, his voice cutting off any further debate. "One round, range is hot." Cade and Bowen backed away, arms crossed, smirks firmly in place. This was going to be hilarious. They'd watch the old-timer lob around into the dirt 1,000 meters short, and then they could all have a good laugh about it over beers. It would be the perfect end to a frustrating day. The old man, whose name they still didn't know, gave a small nod of thanks to Gunny Malone and settled back into his position. He didn't check his wind meter again. He didn't consult his notebook. Instead, he just lay there, perfectly still, for almost a full minute. His eyes weren't closed, but they weren't looking through the scope either. They were scanning the middle distance, watching the way the heat shimmered off the rocks, the way a single blade of grass 100 yards out bent in a slight puff of wind, the way a dust devil spun itself into existence a half-mile away and then died just as quickly. He was reading the air, not with technology, but with a deep instinctual literacy that the younger men couldn't possibly comprehend. They saw chaos. He saw language. He finally lowered his head to the scope, his cheekbones settling into the worn wood of the stock as if it were molded for him. His left hand was a cradle for the rifle's forestock, his right hand resting gently on the pistol grip, his index finger parallel to the trigger guard. His breathing, which had been slow and steady, now became almost imperceptible. He took a deep breath, let half of it out, and then the world seemed to stop. The silence on the range was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind that he alone seemed to understand. His entire process was an exercise in minimalist perfection. There were no wasted movements, no fidgeting, no last-second adjustments. Where the SEALs had been a flurry of calculations and technological consultations, he was a study in stillness. He was a rock, an extension of the very ground he lay on. He made a minuscule adjustment to his elevation turret, a single, precise click, then another to his windage. Click, click. The sounds were so quiet they were almost lost, but in the tense silence, they echoed like hammer blows. He wasn't guessing, he wasn't bracketing. He knew. Then, his finger moved to the trigger. There was no visible tension in his hand, no jerking motion. The rifle didn't fire with a loud, aggressive bark like the big magnums the SEALs were using. It went off with a deep, throaty whoomp, the suppressor turning the violent explosion into a muffled cough. The recoil was a straight, clean push back into his shoulder, the barrel barely rising. The rifle settled instantly back on target, a testament to a perfectly built position. And then, they waited. The flight time for a bullet over that distance is over 4 seconds. It felt like an eternity. Cade was already composing his sarcastic remark. Bowen was shaking his head in amusement. Gunny Malone was just watching, his expression unreadable. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4. Ping. The sound was faint, almost imaginary, a tiny metallic note carried back on the capricious wind. But it was unmistakable. It was the sound of a copper-jacketed lead bullet hitting a steel plate over a mile away. It was the sound of the impossible. For a moment, Nobody moved. The rookies stared downrange as if their eyes could somehow confirm what their ears had just told them. Javi, who still had his spotting scope trained on the target, let out a strangled gasp. "Hit!" he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. "Dead center! It's a dead center hit!" Cade's jaw was literally hanging open. Bowen looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. They both turned to look at the old man. He was already pulling the bolt back, the spent casing ejecting in a graceful arc and landing softly on his shooting mat. He showed no emotion, no triumphant grin, no fist pump, no "I told you so" glance. He simply prepared his rifle for the next shot that would never come. His face a mask of placid concentration, as if hitting a 1-mile-plus shot in treacherous conditions was as routine as making his morning coffee. The lack of reaction was, in its own way, more shocking than the shot itself. It spoke of a level of mastery so profound that success was not a cause for celebration, but a simple, expected outcome. Just then, a black SUV rolled up the dirt road behind the firing line, trailing a plume of dust. The vehicle stopped, and out stepped a man in a crisp, clean uniform, the silver eagle of a captain on his collar. He was lean and fit, with the sharp, intelligent eyes of a commander who carried immense responsibility. This was Captain Marcus Reyes, the commanding officer of this particular training detachment. He had come down to observe the end of his candidate's long-range session. He walked over to Gunny Malone, his eyes sweeping the scene, taking in the stunned expressions on his young operators' faces and the quiet, unassuming figure of the old man packing his ancient rifle. "What did I miss, Gunny?" Reyes asked, his voice calm and authoritative. Gunny Malone just shook his head slowly, a rare look of genuine awe on his weathered face. "You're not going to believe me if I tell you, sir. Our guest here," he nodded towards the old man, "just hit the 2,000-meter plate, cold bore, one shot." Captain Reyes's eyebrows shot up. He knew the conditions. He knew the difficulty of that shot. He had tried and failed to make it himself on more than one occasion. He looked at the old man with a new level of respect. "Is that right? That's one hell of a shot, mister. May I ask your name?" The old man had finished casing his rifle. He stood up, moving a little slower now, the brief flash of lethal stillness gone, replaced once more by the quiet bearing of an elderly gentleman. He turned to face the captain. "Sterling, sir. Leo Sterling." "Well, Mr. Sterling, that was an impressive display of marksmanship. Truly impressive," Reyes said, extending his hand. Leo Sterling shook it. His grip was firm, dry, and steady. "Just a lucky shot, Captain." Gunny Malone, meanwhile, was doing his due diligence, checking the range log where all guests had to sign in. "Protocol, Mr. Sterling. I need to log the shot. Name, caliber, and call sign if you have one you used in service." Leo paused for a second, a flicker of something unreadable in his pale eyes. It looked like reluctance, or perhaps just a weariness with old ghosts. "Remington 700.300 Winchester Magnum," he said quietly. He hesitated again, then added, so softly that Cade and Bowen had to strain to hear, "Call sign, Pathfinder." The name hung in the hot, still air. It meant nothing to the young SEALs. It was just a word. But Captain Marcus Reyes froze. It wasn't a dramatic, theatrical freeze. It was a subtle, chilling cessation of all movement. The hand that had just shaken Leo's, which was halfway back to his side, stopped dead. The polite, professional smile on his face vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, utter shock. His eyes widened, and all the color drained from his face. He stared at the old man, not as a civilian enthusiast, but as if he were looking at a legend that had just walked out of a history book. The air around the captain became thick with a sudden, inexplicable reverence. Cade and Bowen exchanged a confused glance. What was going on? What did that name mean? Reyes took a half step back. His posture, which had been the relaxed stance of a superior officer, shifted entirely. His back straightened into a rigid brace. His hands went from his sides to a formal parade rest behind his back. The change was so instantaneous and so total, it was unnerving. He was no longer a captain addressing a civilian. He was a subordinate in the presence of a senior, a student in the presence of a master. "Pathfinder?" Reyes repeated, his voice barely a whisper. He swallowed hard. "Call sign Pathfinder 1? Leo Sterling gave a slow, small nod. A deep sigh escaped his lips, the sigh of a man whose past had finally caught up with him when all he wanted was a quiet day at the range. "A long time ago, Captain," he said. Reyes's eyes darted from Leo's face to the wooden rifle case, then back again. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind, rearranging everything he thought he knew. The old rifle, the impossible shot, the quiet confidence, the call sign. It was all adding up to a conclusion so incredible he could hardly process it. He turned his head slowly, his gaze falling upon Cade, Bowen, and Javi. His eyes, which moments before had been filled with awe, were now blazing with an intensity that made the young men flinch. His voice, when he spoke, was low, tight, and lethal. It was the voice of a commander about to dissect his troops. "You three," he said, his words clipped and precise. "Did you speak to this man before he fired?" Cade's bravado had long since evaporated. He felt a cold dread pooling in his stomach. "Sir, we just," he stammered. "Answer the question, sailor," Reyes snapped. "Yes, sir," Bowen answered, his own voice tight. "We spoke to him." "And what was the nature of that conversation?" Reyes pressed, his eyes boring into them. "Were you respectful? Did you treat him with the dignity befitting a guest on this range? Or did you treat him like some old man who wandered in off the street?" The silence that followed was damning. The memory of their snide remarks, their condescending tones, their open mockery, now felt like acid in their throats. They looked at the ground, shame washing over them in a hot, suffocating wave. They had acted like arrogant children, and they had done it in front of a man their own commanding officer was now looking at with something approaching worship. Reyes let the silence hang for a long moment, twisting the knife. Then he turned his back on them, dismissing them as if they were insignificant, and focused his full attention back on Leo. "Sir," Reyes began, his voice now filled with a deep, resonant respect that bordered on veneration. "I apologize for the ignorance of my men. They are new. They have not yet learned that the most dangerous weapon in the world is the man, not the equipment he carries." Leo just gave another small nod, his expression one of weary forgiveness. "They're good kids, Captain, full of fire. That's what you want." "Sir," Reyes said again, his voice dropping even lower, almost conspiratorially, as if he were sharing a sacred secret. He gestured towards the three chastened seals. "These men, they've read the books, they've seen the documentaries, they think they know the history of the teams, they know the big names, the famous operations, but they don't know the real stories. They don't know about the men who wrote the playbook, the ghosts." He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Leo's face. "They have no idea who Pathfinder is." He turned back to his men. "You three, front and center." They snapped to attention, their faces grim. "You see this man?" Reyes asked, his voice a low growl. "You see this rifle? You think you're better because you have carbon fiber stocks and computers that do your math for you? Let me tell you who you've been mocking." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. In the winter of 1989, during Operation Just Cause in Panama, a 4-man SEAL sniper team was pinned down on a rooftop. Their position was compromised. The PDF had them surrounded, bringing in a ZPU-4 anti-aircraft gun to tear their building apart. There was no air support available. Their exfil was compromised. It was a death sentence. The three young men listened, their faces pale. This wasn't a story from a book. This was real. "The team leader had a new piece of experimental comms gear," Reyes continued, his voice painting a vivid, desperate picture. "A satellite uplink that was supposed to be able to cut through the jungle canopy. He made one last desperate call on a ghost frequency, a Hail Mary to any friendly asset that might be in the area. He didn't even know if it was working. He just gave his coordinates and said, 'We are being overrun. We need a guardian angel.' The call was picked up. One man picked it up, an operator from a unit that didn't officially exist, working alone, deep in the jungle on a completely separate mission. He was over 2.5 kilometers away, 2,500 meters, through triple canopy jungle at dusk, in the middle of a tropical storm. An impossible shot by any metric, a shot nobody would even attempt." Reyes pointed a finger at Leo. "But Pathfinder attempted it. He had a rifle just like that one, No spotter, no wind meter, just his training and his gut. He had to calculate the shot through layers of foliage, accounting for rain, for wind he could only feel on his face, at a target he could only see in brief flashes between the leaves. The target wasn't a stationary steel plate, it was the gunner on the ZPU-4. The commander's voice dropped to an awed whisper. Pathfinder took one shot, one, from 2,500 meters. The team on the roof didn't even hear the report. They just saw the enemy gunner collapse. He'd been hit in the head. The ensuing confusion gave the team the window they needed to break contact and escape. That shot is not in any official record. It's a legend. A ghost story we tell to remind ourselves what a true master is capable of. The team leader on that roof. That was my first platoon commander. He told me that story himself. He said he owed his life and the lives of his men to a ghost in the jungle he never saw. A ghost named Pathfinder. The range was utterly silent. The wind itself seemed to have stopped to listen. Cade, Bowen, and Javi stared at Leo Sterling, this quiet, unassuming old man, and saw something else entirely. They saw a giant. A founding father of their own tribe, a man who had written the doctrine of their craft in blood and brass. The casual arrogance they had felt an hour ago was a distant, shameful memory. In its place was a profound, gut-wrenching humility. Bowen was the first to move. He took a stiff step forward, his body rigid at attention. He stopped in front of Leo. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "there's no excuse for my behavior. I was arrogant, disrespectful, and unprofessional. I'm deeply sorry." Cade and Javi stepped up beside him, echoing the sentiment, their apologies heartfelt and raw. They had been humbled not by a superior officer's reprimand, but by the quiet, undeniable competence of a true master. They had judged a man by his cover and found their own characters wanting. Leo Sterling looked at the three young faces, scrubbed clean of their earlier cockiness, and saw not the boys who had mocked him, but the men they were trying to become. He saw the immense burden they were training to carry. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "It's all right, sons," he said, his voice gentle. "Pride is a heavy thing. It's useful when it pushes you to be better, but it's a millstone when it makes you blind. The most important lesson you'll ever learn out here has nothing to do with windage or elevation." He tapped his temple with a gnarled finger. "It's about what's in here, humility, the understanding that you are never done learning. The moment you think you're the best, that you have nothing left to learn from anyone, is the moment you become a liability to the man next to you." He looked down at his old rifle, still cradled in his hands. "This is just a tool, a piece of wood and steel. It does what I tell it to. The real weapon is your mind, your discipline, your ability to be calm when the world is exploding around you. That's what that shot was about today. Not hitting the target. It was about finding the stillness. If you can find it here, when nothing is on the line, you might be able to find it when everything is." He looked up at them, his pale blue eyes holding a deep well of wisdom and sorrow, the look of a man who had seen the true cost of the profession they were so eager to join. "You boys are at the beginning of a long, hard road. Be good to each other. Trust your gear, but trust your gut more, and never, ever assume you know who the most dangerous man in the room is just by looking at him." With that, he gave a final nod to Captain Reyes, turned, and began walking slowly toward the parking lot, his wooden case in hand. He didn't look back. Captain Reyes watched him go, holding a respectful silence until the old man's car was out of sight. Then he turned back to his three candidates, who were still standing at attention, their faces a mixture of shame and awe. "Get your gear," Reyes ordered, his voice back to its normal authoritative tone, but with a new undercurrent of gravity. "We're done here for the day. But your education has just begun. Tonight, you're not going to the bar, you're going to the archives, and you're going to learn about the quiet professionals, the men whose names you'll never know, but on whose shoulders you stand." He looked out towards the distant, shimmering target, the tiny speck of white with a fresh black hole punched dead in its center. "And you're going to start," he said, a faint, respectful smile touching his lips, "with the legend of the Pathfinder.